In today's business world, change is the only constant, and mastering transformation is the ultimate key to success. Welcome to Shift and Thrive. I'm your host, Natalie Nathanson. Each week, we'll bring you conversations with CEOs who delve into how they successfully drove critical change in their organization. This show is sponsored by Magnitude Consulting, bringing you the thinking power of a growth consultancy and the getting it done power of a full-service B2B marketing agency. Welcome to another Go-to-Market Spotlight episode on Shift and Thrive, and I am really looking forward to bringing you today's guest. He's spent more than 2 decades helping some of the world's largest companies and fastest-growing startups navigate major business transformations. Starting his career in product design and product development, he went on to lead product strategy before expanding into broader go-to-market roles, including Chief Marketing Officer, Growth Officer, and General Manager, giving him a unique perspective across the entire customer and commercial journey. Along the way, he's held leadership roles at Google, Oracle, Yahoo, HP, as well as multiple category-defining AI startups. Today, he advises founders and CEOs across the AI ecosystem to help shape the next generation of enterprise AI. Amit Pande, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Natalie. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's great to have you. And I really want to start with a transformation story. And I know, lots of companies will reach an inflection point where a lot of different things need to change together, right? Product, culture, go-to-market, et cetera, which can make for a very large transformation. And I know you experienced some of that at Aviso. I believe the company had just brought in a new board and CEO, but would love for you to kind of talk about the core elements you were involved in and kind of what you learned from that transformation.
Natalie, one of the things you never know walking into a new investor and a new board and CEO is how much an inflection point is so counterintuitive to what your past playbooks may have been. The inflection point itself seems really like that it's about taking a company in a slightly different direction or helping it grow better. But really, it's about a product, strategy, marketing, culture, and all of these things shifting at the same time. And so the transformation has so many counterintuitive elements that you can only think about it in reverse. And so I'll share 3 perspectives on this transformation. The first is that the natural tendency when you're coming in as a leader is to add more or do more because there's so much to fix. What we found counterintuitively was that subtraction helped a lot. So whether it's something as trivial as, why are we burning through so much with all of this software and SaaS that was, running sort of on autopilot, and let's just subtract the things that we don't need before we can start adding. That's sort of a more, finance and budgetary sort of sense to this. But if you go all the way to the top of the segmentation perspective of, should we focus on large enterprise, mid-market, SMB? Should we focus on US, international? We subtracted a lot from the equation first. And I think that really helped us because when we then started focusing a stronger product on a more refined segment with a culture where some of the elements of the culture had been subtracted out and trust had been rebuilt, then we were just able to move faster. It's a lot like what I'm trying to do right now, which is first get back into shape and lose weight before I can have the aspiration of running a marathon.
I just want to ask you, because I think that's, it can feel scary for a leader or an organization to subtract and kind of worry, are we shrinking in the case of your audience? Are we shrinking a market that we should have stayed with, and things of that nature. So I'm curious, what was the process you went through for figuring out where and how to subtract and I guess the comfort level around that?
There's a lot of places you can start. I would say that if you go back to this 3-part framework that's existed, it feels like for decades now, of people, process and product. What I found is a lot of the subtraction naturally fell into those buckets. And what I mean by that is, let's start with the people side, because that's the most important thing. If there are people who have persisted and stuck through change over the years, and now they're waiting for a new CEO and their leadership to, come in and tell them what the plan is and work with them on building that plan, then you don't really want to, subtract anything and scare people more other than the things that are getting in the way of doing their work. We had international geographies. We were working very closely with operations outside the US as well, including in India. And the first month my CEO and I traveled, we spent time in town halls, all hands, small groups, everyone sitting around a large, you know, table, Thanksgiving style, having lunch and really trying to understand what was getting in the way of those people. On the product side, we asked ourselves a hard question on whether the audience we were selling the product to and the product actually matched. And then we realized that there were areas in the product that we definitely had to, when I say subtract, I don't mean in software, it's difficult to subtract things, right? If it's in the software, it's in the software.
You can't take things back away from your customers that they're already using.
That's right. What we did is we subtracted by refocusing the energies on certain areas that we knew could be in the product, but they didn't necessarily have to be part of the positioning of the product anymore. For example, if we were working on pipeline inspection, we started saying, let's add more on future quarter pipeline, so that any company would like to know where the future quarter pipeline is going to be. But when it comes to things like reports and analytics, which is more par for the course, we said, well, that's in the product. Let's keep it in the product. But let's not add another 100 reports, because based on what we're learning, it feels like we need to sharpen the product towards this new audience we're going towards. To be just very specific, we were selling the product as a forecasting tool before our time to revenue operations leaders and directors. We expanded into large enterprise and going into a top-down chief revenue officer sale. And so you can now imagine that, we're matching a different product, which has a more CRO level altitude to that audience. And then finally, a quick point about process. Process is about, how people, show up at the office, how they serve customers. And so part of what we subtracted from this process was there was a lot of busy work that would, often happen. Like, hey, prepare this spreadsheet or prepare this PowerPoint, so that then someone shows it to their boss, and then their boss shows it to the CEO. And one of the things I learned tremendously from the CEO that I worked with, who was, I was his right hand through that transformation, was that he would just get all the right people into the room or Zoom around a problem, and then nobody would leave till that set of problems was solved. And what this meant is that people stopped thinking about how to put together the perfect PowerPoint for the boss, and more about how to think about the problem that the boss was asking them to solve. And I, for one, have learned that we should never waste our time making slides to convince each other in an internal audience in a company. We should do all this great storytelling for partners and customers.
Yeah, I love that, and so much of what you shared there.
You grow by making a clear decision sometimes in these inflection points on who you should stop trying to convince. And this is a really important point, because in many companies now I've seen this pattern that if there is a director level person that is in a more back office role, that is the right type of persona for a type of product. But if it's a transformational product, which can impact revenue, and it could be any type of product, it doesn't have to be a product like the one we're discussing here, then you have to find a new type of person. And that requires you to almost shed your old skin as a company. One practical thing that also helped that, I know we'll touch upon later today, is that you have to show a very vivid true north to an organization of what the new success path leads you towards. Because if you don't know, and it has to be an emotional story, you always find that when you can imagine that promised land, you can keep coming back to work the next day, even if some days are good, some days are bad.
I want to ask you to talk about the second area. So we talked about the first of kind of what to subtract. What is your second area from the transformation?
The second area of the transformation was, and this is maybe true more in software and AI than it is in physical world industries, but I believe it's getting true in physical world industries as well, is you have to build and rebuild a company around a product that is just outstanding in what it does. And it has to, the product has to evolve, not thinking about your direct competitors, but really your indirect competitors and the biggest competitor of all, which is the inertia in organizations to not do anything. And so our second, I would say, transformation lever was we just out innovated everybody else on product. And that ultimately brought the rest of the company. Now, you cannot out innovate on product without also having a clear strategy on who the product is for, which we covered earlier, or having the people you need and build trust in those people to now build this product. But what we did was we took a bet. We took a bet that if we work backwards from the customer, the chief revenue officer, the large enterprise officers, these commercial officers. And we asked ourselves, we put ourselves in their shoes, and we start thinking about the budget and the time that is being invested in customer relationship management, customer intelligence tools, CDPs, and then all these tools around activity tracking, forecasting, analytics, call recording. So we did that analysis and said, we need to build a product that solves these problems for the CRO versus just saying, how do we do better forecasting? And so in that arc of the next few years, in shaping the category, shaping the product, and then shaping the revenue in the company, we took the bet that the leaders on the other side who were our buyers would want almost a single pane of glass for their revenue work. And they would want to reduce some of their tooling. And that's a great argument for a CRO and a CFO both. And then they would want to bring all of their team members in revenue, from the CRO to the frontline sales rep to marketing and customer success, all on one platform. And so working backwards from that bit, I would say product innovation. And product innovation, not just in terms of a better product that had more capabilities for a better price, right? So that's the value proposition. But how we built the product was also so counterintuitive. And again, I have so much respect for the CEO who I partnered with in this, because he was a former CRO. He wasn't even a product guy. And what I learned in working with him was that he just took his first principles approach and said, well, why do product managers do it this way? Why do UI designers do it this way? Why are we taking so much time in the QA process? Why do we have 100 tickets open for the last 1 month? And then, after one coming clean call with everybody in the team, you realize, well, half of it is because people aren't talking to each other. So we just started doing more pods and a compression of hierarchies and compression of communication. And I think that just helped our product move faster.
Well, it sounds like it was kind of enabling the culture to be able to move like that and to think about the customer first. So I think that's fantastic. Thank you. And can you take us to the next one?
The third thing I'll talk about is really how to bring integration. And when I say integration, what I mean is the engineers and the support team and the marketing team and the sales team all really anchoring around the clock speed and the behavior change that you need to bring into a prospect or into a customer. And that's something that we did both in terms of everyday tactics and strategy very differently during the transformation. So I'll give you the tactics first, right? Some of the very specific tactics. Like many other companies, we used to have Slack channels, and those Slack channels were separate for engineers for their products, and they were separate for deals for sales. And the deal channels only had sales and marketing, and the product channels only had engineers. And when we started talking to engineers and product leaders in the company, we learned that they had very little idea about what was actually going on the deal making side, and vice versa. And that just is daft, right? Because it's a small company. If you're a small company of 50 or 100 people, you need most people to know most things. And the default we designed was that, if you are adding to more channels than you should be on, you can go quiet on them, or you can, archive them. But if there's only 20 pursuits in a given quarter, and you're one of the lead engineers, you should know what those pursuits are, and you should hear exactly what those people are saying. So what we did is we first of all shifted our product. We stopped using Slack. We started using a product that was built by the former CEO of WebEx. They had this open source version of that collaboration workspace. We embedded that into our own product, and in fact, then that became one of our product offerings. So think about deal rooms, which bring everybody that should be around a deal. Think about customer rooms where it's, with a customer, and you have the people that need to be in with that customer. And that's how we started running the company. This was something that my CEO did brilliantly. Is he said, we're all going to shift from Slack into this new thing. I know there's going to be some pain. An inflection point around a recapitalization or a new funding or a new M&A does not mean that people's habits and behaviors are going to change, as you said. So the behavior change has to be brought in right from the bottom. So, for example, if you are bringing all of your teams now into this new collaboration channel, that also means that you're sending the message to them that you should use email for only very critical things with the CEO and the rest of the leadership. But for quick decisions, there's a hierarchy here. If I need something from you, Natalie, or you need something from me, there's something called a phone. We can text each other or call each other. We should be doing that most actively. And if you're in the office, just walk into that person's room and talk. I mean, these things sound simple, but when trust has to be rebuilt, you have to remind people it's safe to do it. And you start sort of rewarding those behaviors. But then, if I now go into the more strategic aspect of what I meant by integration, it really means that we had to be very parallel in how we were thinking about building product, serving customers, and also getting prospects. So what we found was our existing customers, became such a beachhead for us, both in terms of testing our new messaging as well as testing which features would make most sense. So many more of our feature requests, quarter after quarter after quarter, started coming in from customers because rather than going back every quarter and saying, hey, how are things going? Are things going great? And do you have any support tickets? We said, wait, let's make this a strategic 360 conversation, a QBR where you, my customer, we're spending time with you. We're not just telling you about what we did and how. Remember, we were at its core a time series engine that would also predict your forecast. So it's always good to go back and say, well, we told you we were going to be 98% accurate on your revenue forecast for the quarter. How did we do, right? But we elevated that and said, we've looked at your CRM and all your calls and all your emails very carefully. Here's 5 deals that we believe your team should be looking at that our AI has found. And so you just start thinking about surplus value and where you can inform that value. And then the last 5% of that type of conversation, you say, would it be okay if I showed you some of the things we're thinking about in our roadmap and get your candid feedback on it? And of course, your customers are your single, greatest asset. So I would say that integrating different teams around the customer was our third play. And I think this is something that really helped us with category creation in terms of becoming the first AI chief of staff for go-to-market teams, and then becoming sort of a revenue system for for AI. Because category creation is a very fancy word. I'm always on the fence about how much to use it, but I want to share this with you because you're an entrepreneur, so I think you'll relate to this. That category creation is never about giving a new clever name to a product. It's really about making an old problem impossible enough for the market to ignore. And so you're making it about the problem of the customer and then integrating your organization around it. And then over time, as you get better at it, you start bringing in your partners. I mean, we work with private equity companies, for example, as partners, and said, can we help you with your portfolio companies? We started working with the Salesforce, Microsoft companies and say, can we help you, with things? And so I would say it's an interesting mirror to the first point I mentioned, that you have to subtract a lot. But you have to subtract a lot, you have to innovate a lot, and then you have to integrate a lot. And once that's in place, then in some ways, you are making a company less subject to the individual brilliance of leaders, and you're creating more of an almost like an operating layer for the company itself, right? Because the best companies in the world survive not because the leader lives 200 years, right? They survive because they're able to have succession, and their systems are the engine behind the company. And new generations of people can keep coming and going into those companies. I always tell every founder I advise or CEO I work with that, we're a startup. I love that term, but we have to eventually be grown up.
Yeah. I want to shift gears a bit because we're talking about, all the things that need to go into a transformation. And you touched earlier about, sometimes needing to kind of shed your old skin as part of something like this. And so we can talk about your leadership, we can talk about experiences you've had, but how do you recognize when a business now needs a different version of you, as part of this?
And this is such a great question. And often I, ask myself, how did I find myself in these roles which have titles attached to them where they weren't maybe on my radar a decade ago? And the most honest answer to that is related to the question you just asked, which is that I went to wherever the problem was. And if the problem demanded the marketing side of my brain to be exercised, then that is what I exercised. So in the role that I had prior to Viso, I would really qualify myself as much more of an integrated marketing person, starting through product marketing, with sort of my product roots early in career and so on. But when I was entering Viso, because it was a transformation, I knew that the last thing you should do is um, change the banner above the shop and say under new management and keep the rest of it the same. And so part of the leadership playbook there I've learned is that if what the problem requires you to do right now is to look at a budget closely and understand why we're burning so much, and especially if you're burning on like real estate or we're burning on tools that nobody's even using and nobody even knows when that license was done, you should focus on that first rather than your marketing brain saying, let's run a campaign, let's run a campaign. And if your board insists, as boards often will, hey, when are we going to turn the marketing tap on? You have to balance that because you can't say, well, wait for 6 months. Instead, you give them a very logical point of view on why you will turn certain parts of marketing on in a certain sequence. So a lot of this is about sequencing and prioritizing when you do what you do. For example, if you have AWS reInvent at the end of the year, or you have Salesforce Dreamforce, or you have one of these NVIDIA or other AMD type conferences going on, and those are the anchor events of your industry, there are natural moments in the annual calendar in any industry where now you can go to the market with your new product, your new story, which allows you to interface with the biggest part of the market. But you have to work backwards from that and say, in our approach today, what is the one thing we have to get right this month? I find that with startups, one of the biggest challenges is you are always trying to do so many things that it's very difficult to sometimes separate out the outcome driving activities from the activities that just sort of feel cool, and so I've definitely found in my leadership style that especially because I went in as an individual contributor leader to many of these transformation roles first, and I had to lay the ground before I hired anybody else. And that was something I chose to do at this stage of my career versus earlier in my career. I would hire teams much faster, bring them on, and then kind of figure out the playbook. Because you're an early manager, that's what you do sometimes. You get the resources when you can. I went the exact opposite direction in these transformation moments and said, wait, adding every new person adds complexity right now. So add them at the right time and then add them in areas which are uniquely additive to and multiplicative to your skill sets rather than someone who can do the same thing that I do, because then I'm not going to get that, get that kind of leverage. Uh, Perhaps one last comment on that. I have found in not just the startup world, but in my personal career and style as well, that the best ideas around leadership come from the weirdest and strangest places, not just in terms of talking to people who are leaders of, say, a leader of a theater company, a leader of a nonprofit, a leader of a social movement, can teach you things that sometimes the best Silicon Valley or technology leaders cannot, because their domains are different and they've perhaps dealt with a different level of uncertainty. I read this somewhere, someone told me this, I forget now, but when you plant a seed in good soil, it takes time for those seeds to get adjusted to the soil. And so you have to give time so that the first crop that you do is done effectively. And then the next year, you don't have to do that. So the equivalent of that in this case is you're now bringing in new people into a company, or you have these old people, and now you've changed the leadership, you've changed the product direction, you've changed the segment you're going after. It's pretty scary if you're in the ground. And so one of the first things I remember we did early in our transformation was I remember telling the CEO, we're probably going to have to talk to 50 people over the next 3 days, but I really think we should do it. And there are some people who have already submitted their resignations. And, this is before we've started here, but they're leaving in 2 weeks. But I think we should talk to them also. And you'd be surprised how much people tell you about what they really think is going on in a company, especially if they feel you want to hear their views, even when they're on their way out.
Hey, this is Natalie, your Shift and Thrive host. After chatting with lots of CEOs, one thing is crystal clear. Leveling up your company means having a killer go-to-market strategy. That's what my crew at Magnitude Consulting does every day. If you're trying to step up your marketing game, whether it's strategizing, accelerating your pipeline, expanding into new markets, or getting into AI and automation, let's talk. No pitch, no pressure, just good conversation. Visit shiftandthrivepodcast.com/Natalie to schedule a time. Can't wait to connect. I want to come back to something you said a few minutes ago around coming in as an individual contributor and kind of taking your time to build the team, because I think that sounds very smart, but oftentimes is not the way that the people go about it, right? You are kind of breaking the expectation. Sometimes you might be afraid of losing the budget of your headcount, whatever the case might be. So I'm curious, like, what was going on kind of for you internally as a leader to decide to do that, to trust your gut that it was the right approach? Talk to me about that.
Number one, um, in the startup world, I felt you had to trust the board and the CEO that you were going to work with, that they would make the right decisions to support you with resources once you showed that the blueprint was clear towards success. And so that was important, that psychological factor for me. And they supported me once we started scaling. And eventually I built out a team of 25 people over multiple years. But in that first 6 months, there was a quid pro quo. Show us that the new vision makes sense. Show us that we can go win in this market, and then you can, hire people. I think the second was asking the hard question: what am I optimizing for? And there's a very famous American fighter pilot from decades ago named John Boyd. He is also the person credited with what is called the OODA loop: observe, orient, decide, act, which is how quickly you can, compete, how quickly you can think and change yourself. Right? It's really a rate of adaptation. And he tested this as a fighter pilot, where you have no time to think. You can't be clever about it. You have to immediately iterate, and whoever does that the best wins that battle. So I told myself that if I am creating the leanest environment for me to have the fastest rate of learning and iterate the fastest, it would either be with someone that I've trusted over a long time. Maybe they've been with me in the trenches for the last 10 years, and we can do a lot of things in an unspoken way, or I have to build that foundation and then bring that person in. Now, my boss had that luxury because we had worked together for 5 years in the previous company in a different context, and we had built a lot of trust and chemistry with each other. So in some sense, he was bringing me in also alongside him in this new journey, but I think he knew I'd be comfortable with that. So that was the way I thought about it. But when I went to C3, which was my last role, I had a similar dynamic. I came in as an individual contributor. There, the math was different. I knew that the resources existed inside the company. I didn't have to hire them, but I would have to just build the business case enough and bring enough customer demand in that then I would get access to those resources. I do think this is a great question you've touched upon, because for so many of us who are now mid-career or stepping into that stage where in the past you were judged by how many team members you have, I think the new equivalent of that we should all be asking boards or companies we work with is, I'm not necessarily asking you about the people that I'll get, but I'm asking about the resources I'll get. And, maybe in this world, it's also a token budget. Maybe it's also an AI budget and how much AI I'll be able to have access to, because the difference between the teams that have industrial grade, absolutely top shelf AI, versus, everyday AI, which is more, us, figuring out the best way to host a weekend event or something, that gap is going to increase. So, when I was sleeping last night, I had this idea. I said, and I thought I'll share this with you on the podcast, which is, I think we shouldn't just be asking about human resources. Now we should be asking about, token and AI resources and saying, well, what is that going to be like? Because if you can give me enough so that I can now spin up a new go-to-market team, which has go-to-market team members, and then all the AI I need to power my go-to-market, I think then we can be in business because a small team, this has been true throughout history, but a small team with 10 people, 5 people, with access to the right tools and the right motivation can actually outperform a 100%, 200% team. I've seen it all the time.
Yeah, yeah. I love that. And I love that kind of shift in the conversation around resources. I often experience it in terms of kind of my consulting world is, someone might, CEO, kind of a company might be set on hiring in-house and kind of have blinders on to kind of other approaches to bring in. The focus on resources is kind of proof of the trust in the leader to make the right choices and knowing that there's different ways of solving that. And you're not kind of presupposing for them what that looks like. So I do love that. And I think that brings us a bit into kind of the conversation around AI that I was hoping to have. And really like maybe a bit of AI with the go-to-market. So would love to hear from you. Where do you feel CEOs should be focusing when they look at kind of redesigning kind of their team, their go-to-market, just the approach to make kind of better decisions and kind of enable their leaders in this environment?
When we think about the most important moments in our own life, when we've had the most success or we've been challenged the most, I find that it was always the quality of our central nervous system, the brain that was invisible to us, that perhaps gave us that insight that helped us avoid trouble or to have a good nose for where opportunity is. And the more science has learned about the way the brain works, they realize it's not just like up here. It's actually, the brain is around your body. You have a brain, you have a gut brain, you have, all these distributed ways of thinking about intelligence. That is the potential of AI for CEOs and for companies, is that it really becomes your extended brain of sorts, but also it's baked into your organization almost as biological intelligence. Because if you think about the last 3 decades of software, it was a really important foundation. We needed that foundation, but pre-AI, most of that foundation is plumbing and bookkeeping. That is not really the kind of intelligence we're talking about here. We're talking about the kind of intelligence that allows us to adapt quickly in new markets with new products, think about current and perceived competitors, and just respond faster and better. And those who have that fastest rate of learning with AI will just outcompete. I mean, the interesting thing today is it's very hard to get to $1 million when you're a new startup, but it's way easier to get to 100 million from that 1 million. Why? It's because when you think about what leadership can do with AI, it's never really about heroics. And I think too much of leadership is associated with heroics, and that's because it comes from, the history of wars and countries. But actually, I think that what leadership means in this era of AI is that, it's really about creating systems with AI so that the heroics become less important. And now the systems can, take you forward. So now let's get one level more specific, right? So co-pilots came into the enterprise a couple of years ago. And what was the job of co-pilots? It was to, help individuals do things that they were already doing, but just do them better. That's really the truth, right? You were creating, for the first couple of years of co-pilots, you were maybe using them to create a dashboard or a spreadsheet or maybe spin up a mini application, which you would have done in PowerPoint earlier. Could you have done it without the co-pilot? Yes, in most cases, yes. So then it should be clear to us that that era of co-pilot was really just about making us slightly more efficient on the things we were hesitant to do. I don't think that's really, AI in its truest sense, right? AI in its truest sense is you say, wait, let's work backwards. What is my product? My product is this product, okay? This product, but this product may be a home robotic system, okay? Or an industrial warehouse robotic system, okay? Who are all the companies in the world I could sell to right now? Who are all the companies in the world that have some intent of looking into this area right now? Okay. Now, how do I capture that intent? Okay, how do I set up AEO, GEO, SEO machines to now create the kind of, let's just say, air cover, air game so that those companies can learn about me by me educating them about the problem. Problem education, buyer education is the best kind of marketing. So I think when I think about AI in the context of go-to-market, certainly I often think about how, it's about explaining why something has happened, but more about what we should do next, creating shared understanding across the company. So, that integration pillar I spoke to you about earlier, I really think AI can be the technology is not quite there yet. Shared agent memory is a newer area companies are investing in because your agent and my agent don't need to talk to each other. But imagine if all our agents can sort of, hang out in this trusted agent space, and then they're coming back to us with ideas. I think that's the potential, of AI, I really say, which is that, we have a wider field of view and we just have more at bats to succeed because this is almost something I feel emotional about. I see way more companies and founders with good products, well-meaning technology, and they have absolutely no idea what they can do on their go-to-market. And I wrote a LinkedIn post about this last week. I met this friend who was a colleague at my last company. He's at this agentic control plane company. This is a term you've heard a couple of times. Sorry, it's this agent control plane that can, run across the company. He said, now look, the problem is everyone's saying the same things. But when we go to the customer is really now differentiating between all of us on how our sales process is different. And the sales process is becoming a lot like a solution and a consulting process while being a sales process. So, so that's where I really see the potential of AI and all of these. I didn't touch as much upon, AI for HR and finance. I do think that those areas have tremendous, room as well. But to bring it back home, I think the biggest value a CEO can get today is that every CEO or every president, every military leader will always have this, this one like person that's their trusted ally. Back in the days, even the word strategy comes from the word strategos, which is I think it's a Greek Roman construct. There used to be a person like that who was the king's sort of brain, and they would often be hidden. In fact, there would be soldiers around them because they wanted to protect that brain that was telling them how to win in battle. And then over times, other terms like this evolved, right? Consigliere and sort of Jiminy cricket and this kind of this conscience by one shoulder that's helping you. I think CEOs can use AI for that. I think the $1 billion company to be made for an AI that a CEO can really trust as like it's the CEO's chief of staff.
Yeah, I'm finding myself kind of in that demographic where I would love to have something like that already built and already accessible. You have some things in this tool, some things in another tool, right? Like bringing it all together. And I think that's also, in the inertia to change behaviors and to get over the fear of having all of that information in your life everywhere, I think is one of the hurdles that company will face that does finally crack the code on that kind of brain for CEOs and other leaders.
100%, 100%. And I think this is why the shift to open source models and sovereign AI, and you should keep all your data locally. I'm 100% with you on this, Natalie. I have not yet connected, AI systems into my personal emails. I don't give it full access to my desktop. Maybe I'm just an older school person, old school of thought person that way. But I'm also taking steps into this gingerly, and I've found that a lot of people are starting to talk about how do you build your second brain. You and I are having this podcast in July 2026. I'm telling you right now, this is the summer where the second brain thing or this organization brain thing is starting to get more real. I suspect that by the end of this year, you'll just start seeing this more in the language of companies saying, I'm building this kind of brain. And then again, the burden will be on buyers to say, wait, what do you mean by, brain? Are we talking dolphin brain, crow brain, human brain? Like, what are we talking about?
Yeah, it's so interesting. What other question I want to ask you on this topic, because I think, you and I are both, in the mode of looking at how do you kind of think and look differently? How do you build those kind of fundamentally different approaches that are not just about efficiency, but are about thinking differently? And I know, like speaking for myself, but also for many others I know, like encouraging that shift in mindset in kind of how you work, how you think, being ready to turn a process or something on its head How have you been successful in getting kind of teams and folks to think along those lines?
At a most fundamental level, one thing that's become very clear to me as the years go by is that once you figure out how something works, um, it almost feels too simple to be true, but often it's true. And so, I've been saying this for the last 10 years to people that I work with, that sometimes you have to think your way out of a problem, and sometimes you have to act your way out of a problem. You can't think your way out of it. And action by itself means movement, moving in sometimes unknown directions and groping in the dark, if you will. And then you find some patterns, and you need to know when action is the right approach and when thinking is the right approach. So it's principles like these that have really, really helped me. If there is a team, for example, that just doesn't talk to each other, people have some bad past relationship, or they've had fights, and they've kind of built up this animosity towards each other. You can have as many strategy sessions and get two adults in a room and say, well, why don't you both talk more with each other? Why aren't we working better? But perhaps there's a better way. Maybe that better way is to take that team, go to your favorite gym, or go to your favorite musical performance, and get people out of this mindset where they're stuck. There's a beautiful documentary on Amazon Prime, which is called The World of Titan. Titan is this exquisite watch company that was started by the Tata Group, which is India's most respected business group over like a few decades. And Titan was the first watch company where they really wanted to build a world-class watch, and at some point they built the world's slimmest watch. And it's about how they were looking for the tune, the theme, the brand. What's that? Again, they were all stuck. And then the gentleman who started the company, who's now dead, the original gentleman, Derek Tata, there was a Mozart conference. There was a Mozart a show that was happening in Bombay in that era, and he took his whole team for the show. And when they're there and they're listening to this, and there's one part of the symphony where you can see that they all felt like perhaps that part of the symphony could be the brand tune. And I can tell you, for the 1.5 billion people that have memories of this, who grew up in India or are from the Indian diaspora around the world, that tune, it's a Mozart tune, but it's associated with that brand. And it's because they stepped out of that skill. It's you have to sometimes sort of feel that. So I found that more and more I'm certainly relying on the intellect, but I'm relying so much more on what's going on here. What's the energy in this room? What is someone not telling us? Follow the money, follow the information, follow the incentive, and you can go pretty far in understanding why something has not changed. And if you start applying that first principles process, then you can get really far.
Yes, that's some great information. So thank you for sharing that. And I know we only have a few minutes left, Amit. Would love to close with a question I like to ask every guest, and that is, what is the best piece of advice you've been given that still shapes you?
Somebody gave me this advice very early in my career, where we were trying to sell a sponsorship of $50,000 to someone, and they weren't listening. And I tried to give them more justification. And then when we walked out of that meeting, the person I was with, who was running the conference, he said, you're 24 years old, but I should give you this advice. And this was a former Fulbright fellow. He said, if you're in this conversation and the other side's not listening, imagine taking your head into this island in Hawaii and just go quiet for 10 seconds, because if they're not ready to buy right now, they're not ready to buy right now. Don't try to fill that empty space. And in those 5 seconds, just leave that empty space. That was advice 20 years ago. I've had advice from my former CEO saying, listen, I don't think you're ready to be a CEO in this area yet. And that was like maybe 5 years ago. So I said, okay, I'm going to challenge myself more to be a CEO. When I took on the GM role, I built more muscle around that area. And will I be a CEO or not in the future? I don't know yet. But of course, working on my own portfolio projects, I'm sort of trying to do that right now. So I think that slightly harsh but well-meaning advice is the best kind of it.
Yeah, I love that. That's great advice, and also signals needing really good self-awareness. to be able to, close those gaps and do that. So thank you for sharing that. And as our listeners want to get in touch, what's the best way to reach you?
The best way to get in touch with me is LinkedIn. I'm most active there and a little bit on Substack. And then for some of my other creative projects, like the new graphic novel that I'm working on, which is really strategy, but strategy as science fiction, 50, 60 years from now, I think we'll most likely be on more active on Instagram, but I'll be talking about it on LinkedIn as well.
Okay, wonderful. And I know we didn't have time to get into your graphic novel, which sounds fascinating and kind of tying where we are today as a society with the future. So would definitely love to hear more, and we can add a link to that in the show notes. And thank you so much for everything that you shared today.
Thank you so much, Natalie. It was a pleasure talking to you.
It was great to have you on, and I loved so much of what we talked about, from the lessons you shared around the transformation of subtraction and product excellence and integration, the conversation around the second brain, and hopefully where we're heading soon, and making sure that that is done right. And then I just love the common thread of borrowing from other disciplines. I know I certainly have some new food for thought based on what you shared. So thank you for that. And I'm sure so many valuable takeaways for our listeners.
Thank you so much, Natalie. Have a wonderful rest of your day.
Thank you. You as well. And thank you too to everyone that's listening. And if today's conversation sparked something for you, and I'm sure that it did, please pass this along to another leader in your network, because we know that these are the kinds of conversations that really help all of us build stronger, smarter organizations and go-to-market engines. So thanks again, Amit. And this has been another wonderful conversation on Shift and Thrive. I'll see you all next time.